we have the very brave souls, the really committed ones who come on Friday afternoon in the last day of term. So it's great to see you here for the final in this year's series of the cutting edge issues in development thinking and practice. And Laura Mann gives her apologies, but she fell ill, so she couldn't be here this time. But of course, we'll be watching it on YouTube. I have to remind everybody that this will be taped. That's why it can be on YouTube. You know? And I'm also supposed to remind you that if, heaven forbid, there were a fire alarm, then we're supposed to exit out the front and walk round to the Sosi Hawk Student Center, I think it is, isn't it? Okay, so I don't think, is there any other information I haven't done this since last year, so, okay. So let me introduce our speakers that we're really lucky to have. So we have Professor Alexander Betts, who's going to be speaking about authoritarian sanctuaries, refugee politics in East Africa. And you're really lucky to have this scholar, and this I would almost call activist scholar, and given the kind of research that you've done over time, who is one of this country's leading experts on refugees and has done an awful lot of ethnographic field and sort of, I think, very insightful research on refugee economies. So Alexander Betts is from the University of Oxford. He is the professor of forced migration and international affairs. He has been looking at access to socioeconomic rights and opportunities in East Africa and in Europe over time. He's got this incredible book. He's got 12 books anyway. I won't recite them all. But he's got this incredible book called The Wealth of Refugees, How Displaced People Can Build Economies. He leads the Refugee Economics Program. He has a whole raft of involvements and honors. He is quite the TED Talk giver. So you're in for a treat. So we're really delighted you could take the time out to come to London. And we're also, I'm really happy personally, you're really lucky that we have Arbie Baguios, who's doing his PhD in our department, who in himself and before and in between starting a master's here some years ago, he's been very active. He's a humanitarian and development professional, founder of Aid Reimagined. He's done all sorts of things, worked for Action Aid, Save the Children, the Red Cross, and UNICEF. And he's one of these special guys who was awarded the ESRC PhD studentship to pursue his PhD. We're particularly lucky because he's just come back. Oops, I have no microphone, so I can't walk around. He's just come back from 9 months, or not just, but a couple months ago, 9 months in Kenya, in the refugee camps, doing research inspired by Alexander Betts' work. So we couldn't have a better discussant for this. So let's welcome Professor Betts in the usual way.
Thank you, James, for that very warm introduction, and really delighted to be sharing this platform with Arbie, who's a brilliant and bright upcoming scholar in this area, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And thank you to all of you on the 13th of December, the last day of term, for being here. I wondered if I would face an absolutely empty lecture theatre, and I would have blamed no one had that been the case. But I'm really delighted that we have an audience and that we can hopefully have a great conversation. As James said, a lot of my work focuses on the political economy of refugee rights. So there's sort of two threads to my work. I'm very interested in the economic and political lives of refugees themselves. And the second strand is I'm really interested in how we explain state and government behaviour towards refugees and displaced people, particularly when and under what conditions governments are prepared to give refugees access to socioeconomic rights. And what I'm going to talk about this evening is work in progress. It's the next book project that I'm doing with Julia Spears, a colleague of mine. And in many ways, it's historical. And it's trying to think about the conditions under which a certain category of governments, authoritarian regimes, actually give quite progressive sets of particularly socioeconomic rights to displaced people. So, as I say, this is work in progress. If there's something that seems a bit off as an argument, then raise it. It's probably not perfected yet. I'm looking forward to the feedback and the conversation on this. So I'm starting, as many academics do, with a puzzle. Something that I don't know the answer to, something I observe in the world, but I want to find an answer to because I think it matters for the academic literature and for policy and practice. And it starts from a simple observation, that authoritarian states host the majority of the world's refugees. Now, I'm thinking about that in simple terms, that if we take sort of Freedom House's definition of authoritarian states, those where there is an absence of political freedom, partial political freedom, or no political freedom, about 68% fall in the main category of the absence of political freedom. And that's basically calculating the populations of those countries and the number of refugees and looking at what proportion of the world's refugees are inhabiting those particular countries. When we move into East Africa, which has around 5 million refugees today, which is around a sixth of the total refugee population around the world, the majority of them, about 4.4 million, are in countries regarded as not free. The remaining 600,000 are in Kenya, which is discussed as being partly free. So really this is a big challenge. If we want to leverage access to refugee rights, we need to understand the behaviour and decision-making of authoritarian, or in some cases semi-authoritarian regimes. The challenge there is we've got a bit of a gap in the academic literature, that most research on refugee politics focuses on so-called liberal democratic states. It's very much focused on the role that elections and majoritarian play is in play in pushing against access to refugee rights. So it's noted in that literature that obviously when voters have a big say in refugee rights, they often privilege the rights of citizens over and above non-citizens. But on the other hand, there are ideas of embedded liberalism that have been written about by many scholars, from Christian Jopka to Matthew Gibney to Jim Holyfield, describing the fact that through courts, through legal norms, through liberal ideas, often those liberal democratic regimes, despite the threat of majoritarian populism, continue to uphold the right to asylum and a notion of refugee rights. But what we don't have is as much literature about authoritarian regimes, or indeed work in refugee studies that thinks about the role of regime type in shaping the policies and practices of receiving governments. And there's a bit of a paradox that emerges, which is that authoritarian states sometimes have many of the policies that are regarded, at least by liberal internationalists and international organisations like UNHCR, as among the most progressive in the world. So we can critique on many levels states like Turkey, Colombia, Iran, Uganda. They are not free and liberal states and societies. And yet those are the countries that often allow refugees a significant level of socioeconomic rights, the right to work, de facto or de jure, a degree of freedom of movement, the opportunity to live in cities. So while by no means perfect in their human rights records in general, or even in their refugee policies, they are the states that often are willing to host large numbers of refugees and offer them significant degrees of socioeconomic integration. So I'm interested in explaining that paradox and unpacking what's going on. The way I'm going to do that is by focusing historically, mainly on 4 historical dictators who were all around in the 1970s. And during that period in the 1970s, all 4 of these dictators' regimes were regarded as, quote, liberal by UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, in terms of their refugee policies. And we're looking at the regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia, known for the Red Terror that caused the death and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. Idi Amin, known for the expulsion of the Ugandan Asians and his tyrannical regime. Jafar Nimeri in Sudan, known for oppressing the South Sudanese. And Juvenal Habyarimana in Rwanda, known for the repression of the Tutsi minority in ways that arguably contributed to the events that led to the Rwandan genocide. None of these are your archetypes of liberal leadership. None of them are known for their good records on human rights. And yet all of them, at different times, particularly in a period of the 1970s, were lavishly praised by the international community for their refugee policies. So I want to partly describe some of those refugee policies and partly explain what's going on in order to shed light on how we make sense of contemporary refugee policy and practice. And I'm going to make 3 main claims in this lecture. The first is that these dictators of the 1970s created refugee policies that at the time were widely regarded as liberal. Whether we judge them to reach the standards that we would describe as liberal is a slightly different question. The second claim I'm going to make is that their legacies continue to shape refugee policies today. So it's not just that they developed these practices at the time, it's that they have an enduring and ongoing legacy. So Idi Amin, I'm going to suggest, shaped Uganda's self-reliance policies in ways that continue today and continue to be celebrated by the international community. I'm going to suggest that Mengistu's Ethiopian policies and practices shape the delicate balance that exists in Ethiopia today between encampment policies and a degree of willingness to tolerate some element of freedom of economic rights and the right to work in Ethiopia. The third claim I'm going to make is this continues to matter. It matters for the politics of authoritarian sanctuary today, and that's important from a problem-solving perspective. If indeed we have organisations like UNHCR or governments trying to influence more progressive policies around the world, then they need a lens through which to think about that politics that is not just the liberal democratic lens, but takes into account what might be different about these particular regime types. But it also matters from a more critical perspective. Many of the states that I'm discussing this evening, Sudan, Rwanda, Ethiopia, are the subject of bilateral agreements by European states. You'll all be familiar with the UK-Rwanda deal on the removal of asylum seekers, the agreements that the European Union has reached with Sudan relating to refugee policy. And it's important that we understand in depth some of the political motivations among those states if we're going to make sense of and have a critical vantage point for thinking about some of those contemporary politics today. Just in terms of the methodology that Julia and I use in this work, it's predominantly historical work, and we draw largely upon UNHCR archives in Geneva. Now, the UNHCR archives are very selective. You get access to documents up to a certain point, a 20-year cutoff. So at the moment, we can go up to about 2004 in that archival research. But they're selectively curated. Documents are inevitably removed over time, and they reflect a liberal internationalist bias and the story that is recorded through staff memos, through what that organisation is willing to share, through what it's been willing to catalogue and curate over time. So we tried to go beyond that. We also draw upon national newspapers and government archives, working within the national archives available in the capital cities of those countries. Now that's an uneven source of possibility. So in Addis Ababa, for instance, Ethiopia has quite good national archives, albeit that they're predominantly in Amharic. Other countries like Rwanda, much harder to access, certainly pre-Rwandan genocide documents that have been very much curated and selectively made available. One of the things that I think is innovative about this work is that we've tried to use some refugee settlement archives. So in Uganda in particular, the Office of the Prime Minister has allowed us to be the first scholars from outside the country to be able to look at their national archives, both in Kampala, but also in many of the refugee settlements. Disorganised archives, but archives available in some of the settlements across the country, which have been really interesting and a rich source of more localised and nuanced information about context. We've also worked with research assistants with lived experience. In many cases, those have been refugees present in the host countries that we've looked at, who we've worked with to look at some of that archival work, particularly where we've been working in languages that have been unfamiliar to us. And that's allowed us access to a different set of material. It's also been an opportunity to work with aspiring historians at often the graduate level of their work. But it's also introduced challenges. Many have required anonymity because they are looking at, in this work, the politics of these authoritarian regimes and have sanctuary in those countries. We're also in the process of doing a little bit more oral history, trying to map out who is still available from these eras, who we can speak to and make sense of those experiences, including trying, where we can, to speak to people with lived experience of being refugees in those countries during the eras that we're looking at. Just want to begin by fleshing out the kind of theoretical framework that we're developing, and then I'll get into the material empirical context. The theoretical framework we're describing as the logic of authoritarian sanctuary, suggesting that there's a different logic that drives the behaviour of authoritarian regimes compared to liberal democracies in this space. And there's a shift we're trying to make in a way from the so-called liberal paradox towards thinking about what Caterina Natter has described as the illiberal paradox. So Jim Holyfield, a scholar of immigration politics in the United States, was the first to describe in 1992 the so-called liberal paradox. And that paradox was the idea that on the one hand, many liberal democracies need immigration. They face particular demographic pyramids, they need access to labour, and they know that immigration serves a positive economic benefit for their countries and societies. And yet, on the other hand, the politics is often more negative, particularly around concerns to do with culture and security, and majoritarianism can push against. Caterina Natter has built upon that to develop the idea of the illiberal paradox in relation to immigration more broadly. So Natter, in particular, suggests that some illiberal regimes, often paradoxically, welcome immigration. And this, she suggested, is because there is a lower cost on those regimes politically than there is for liberal democracies. Authoritarian regimes, she suggested, can take in large numbers of labour migrants because they're less likely to be punished by their electorates, who by definition don't have the vote and the same influence. So they can value the rights and access opportunities of non-citizens and the economic benefits more highly. And she's fleshed that out in a fantastic monograph comparing Morocco and Tunisia, a more authoritarian regime with a more democratic regime, and found that the regime type underpins a little bit of that paradox. What hasn't been explored is the extent to which that same paradox plays out more generally in a refugee context. So part of this involves thinking about what an authoritarian regime is. We often have a variety, a typology of regime types, semi-authoritarian regimes, competitive authoritarian regimes. I'm very much following Milan Svolik's idea that authoritarianism is not a matter of degree, but a difference of type. That authoritarian regimes are fundamentally different from liberal democracies, and that the dividing line is whether or not a regime has free and fair elections to elect either the legislature or the executive. And in the absence of one or other of those, a regime can be regarded as authoritarian. So it's a more binary understanding that he develops in his work that we follow. And part of the argument is that if we think about authoritarian regimes, they're motivated primarily by regime survival. By definition, they are seeking to stay in power. And they're less concerned about doing that via the ballot box because to a large extent it either doesn't exist or it's irrelevant to them. And what they need to do to stay in power is manage both elites and the masses, often managing elites through carrots and sticks and managing the masses through a degree of coercion, but also sometimes patronage. So how do they do that and how do they achieve that in ways that keep them in power? Now, the argument here that we're making is that hosting refugees for an authoritarian regime trying to stay in power imposes lower political costs than in a democratic regime, but confers far greater political benefits. So the cost side is very much what I described with Caterina Natta. You can value the rights of non-citizens more easily if you don't have to face electoral consequences. But the additional step is to argue that there are particular benefits that refugees bring that are useful to authoritarians and dictators that aren't easily available through many other means. And those three benefits from hosting are money, weapons, and followers, the very three things that many people in the authoritarian regime's literature identify as essential for authoritarian regimes to access in order to sustain regime survival. How do they access money? By externalizing. How do they extrovert, in the words of people like Jean-Francois Béat, to access resources that come from outside that buttress their particular elite networks hold on power? How do they access weapons that ensure that a minority, a clientelistic group, can stay in power and repress a majority that may be opposed to their rule? And how do they gather followers? If you're practicing authoritarianism, you're likely to have made yourself unpopular to certain groups, you're likely to represent certain interests but not others. How do you get access to followers, not just from within the country, but potentially external to the country? And this is what leads us to our core conceptual framework. So this is the basic argument and the basic framework underlying the work. And it's to work with this idea of, empirically, where do we see these benefits in terms of followers, weapons, and money being conferred on dictators by hosting refugees, and what does that do causally to translate into policies that end up being described and narrated as liberal and progressive? One of the key aspects of this is we also look at more contemporary regimes in the four countries I'm describing. So Museveni in Uganda, looking at the Bashir regime in Sudan, looking at the Kagame regime in Rwanda, for instance. But there's a fundamental shift that takes place with the end of the Cold War. In the Cold War period, the predominant motivation around followers, weapons, money is a security paradigm. East-West rivalry means there are external opportunities to appeal to the United States or the Soviet Union, access some of those resources, and use them to control and manage the domestic population while destabilizing neighboring enemies that might be on the opposite side of those post-Cold War alignments. In the post-Cold War, there's much more of a development paradigm, that the benefits in terms of followers, weapons, and money are conferred through development. So in terms of followers in the Cold War context, it's a lot about government recruitment, recruiting refugees, as I'll show, into political parties, the civil service, government, the military. In the context of the post-Cold War context, it's about bringing money in that can be shared through patronage to borderlands and hinterlands, redirecting refugee aid to strengthen support amongst citizens who may otherwise be excluded from the benefits of public goods. In terms of weapons, in the security context of the Cold War, a lot of this is about supporting the means to engage in cross-border incursions, supporting rear bases in borderlands, refugee camps that train and arm rebels in camps that can be used to destabilize neighboring enemies that might be a threat to regime survival. Those weapons take on a slightly different form in the post-Cold War context. Kelly Greenhill has written a book called Weapons of Mass Migration, where actually the threat to potential donors is that without support for protection practices and development assistance to support refugees, there might be the secondary onward movement of refugees towards donor countries. And similarly around money, there was geopolitical alignment that enabled countries to signal that they were aligned with the US or the Soviet Union. They could bring funding in to support refugees from hostile states and thereby signal that they were aligned in a particular way that brought in money. And today, the variant of that is through accessing international aid in policy for aid deals, like the Rwanda-UK deal. So I'll explain how this plays out across the four cases, but that's the basic theoretical framework that I'm working with in this lecture. So let me begin with the substance of Uganda. And I'll give sort of overview slides that give you a sense of where we're going. And I'll develop these as I go, showing descriptively what's happened in terms of Uganda's overarching policy framework, and then trying to explain how some of these liberal aspects emerged in the Amin regime in terms of followers, weapons, and money. It's worth saying that Uganda is massively celebrated around the world by the World Bank, by UNHCR, by academics for supposedly having one of the most progressive sets of refugee policies in the world. Uganda, unlike many neighbouring states, Kenya and Tanzania for instance, allows refugees the right to work and freedom of movement. It allows refugees access to plots of land in the settlements, albeit that the size of those plots of land has been shrinking. There's been significant land disputes, the availability of arable land has declined. As more people have arrived from South Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's been pressure. But Uganda somehow, despite the challenging nature of Museveni's regime, despite the challenging nature of practices towards LGBTQ+ communities, towards freedom of press, has been celebrated for refugee policy. What's important to note is a lot of those practices are not new, and they weren't created by Yoweri Museveni. They preceded his regime. And many were created, as I'll show, by Idi Amin. But they also have their starting points far before that. So in the colonial context, the British protectorate under colonial rule created many of the seeds of the self-reliance policy. The British protectorate welcomed European refugees, particularly Polish refugees, in the Second World War. It developed the first legislation in Uganda that continued to shape practice through much of the post-colonial period, the Control of Alien Refugee Act in 1960, that already allowed refugees to own cattle and cultivate land. The colonial regime also created some of the early settlements. Nachivali, the oldest continually running refugee settlement in Africa, was created in 1959, Orochinga in 1961, and Chiaka in 1962, all settlements that in different guises continue today. And the colonial period saw the influx of Rwandan Tutsi refugees from the late 1950s. This was partly developed by Milton Obote, first as Prime Minister and then President in the period of 1962 to 1971. He created the Ministry of Culture and Community Development to deal with refugee affairs. Now, it's interesting that community was part of the MCCD, introducing immediately a local element where government interest in local government and ensuring access to patronage amongst local communities was built into refugee policy and practice. Obote created 12 settlements by 1964. He was speaking and sending his foreign minister to UNHCR meetings in Geneva. As early as 1964, Uganda told the international community about its self-supporting policy of supporting free livers who could live in urban areas, have access to plots of land in settlements, things that have subsequently been narrated as new and progressive by the international community. Shangwali was opened as a self-reliant settlement, and UNHCR said the refugees could be brought into this area if they are not lazy and they are brought in the right time. They can become self-supporting in food and cash from cash crops within 1 year. And at that time, a quarter of Africa's refugees were hosted by Uganda, and Uganda became one of Africa's first members of UNHCR's Executive Committee, and UNHCR opened a branch office in Uganda. At the time, Uganda's Assistant Director for Refugees said when they get here, they find life so comfortable that few of them ever dream of going back. But it was really with Amin, somewhat surprisingly, that these policies were deepened and strengthened and formalised. In his early years, Idi Amin threatened to expel the refugees from Uganda. Amin was a Kakwa from the Sudanese border region, and he had relatively little support from the Bugandan population that dominate politics around Kampala and the region around Kampala. He was looking for support, but in his early speeches he suggested he would expel the refugees. He said, all refugees in Uganda go back to the countries that you've come from as soon as possible. They need to go back so that their camps can be used by Ugandans who have no homes or are without jobs. And until 1963, he worked with neighbouring governments, Kayibanda in Rwanda and Nimyeri in Sudan, to support repatriation. And then from 1976, there was a shift. Amin realised that given where he came from as a Kakwa, given the alienation of his support base, the Bugandan population that had been loyal to Obote, he needed refugees to stay in power. Refugees were Amin's key to maintaining the survival of his regime. He faced rumbling rebellion and mutiny and was reliant not on soldiers from a Bugandan background, but refugee soldiers whom he recruited for the army and for the civil service. He started to do things that appeared deeply liberal. He acceded to the 1951 Refugee Convention, signing a liberal international treaty on refugee rights. He committed to work on a new Refugee Act for the country. He created and upgraded existing and new settlements. He was the leader who put vocational training centres, schools and health centres into some of the settlements that Obote had created and gazetted. It's also worth noting that Uganda at the time was strikingly tolerant of urban refugees. At the time, most refugees in Africa were in remote borderland settlements, or we saw the emergence at the start of what would become refugee camps. But 65% of Rwandans, at the time the largest refugee population in Uganda, were living in cities, and many were in government jobs, some very well-paid jobs, with no restrictions on the right to work. The settlements were protected, and where there were localised land disputes, Armin intervened personally to ensure that refugees' access to land was upheld, often over and above the rights to land claims of the local population. And UNHCR claimed, through the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, who visited Kampala and visited Armin's residence, that Uganda's contributions to refugee settlement is more than all the other African countries put together. Refugees do not need work permits except when they are going to work for the government. Refugees are free to move in and out of settlements. So the question is why? Why was Armin, given what we know about him, so keen to adopt these liberal policies? Well, his support was coming from often Rwandan refugees in the southwest and other ethnic Kigezi along the Rwandan border. And he was balancing against the Lango, the Acholi, and the Buganda, from who he faced significant opposition. He appointed many Banyarwanda, whether Rwandan or from the border region, to his senior military and ministerial positions. There were a whole series of ministers who were appointed who were from border regions or indeed from the other side of the borders. Armin was even recruiting Rwandan spies. One current civil servant told us off record that Idi Amin employed Rwandese as spies. These Rwandese Tutsis were employed in his military to spy on the rebels on the other side, but they also played a role domestically. I think what's very interesting is when we see the contrast immediately after Armin, it gives rise to a recognition that Armin relied upon refugees for his policies. So when the Armin regime came to an end, Milton Obote seized back power violently, and there was a sudden backlash. And for the only time in its history, Uganda adopted an encampment policy, forcing the refugees who were in urban areas back into settlements and changing those settlements into structures that were much more camp-like, with restrictions on freedom of movement. This was done in both the southwest of the country, where Rwandans were based, but also in the West Nile area. So in September 1982, there was the forced roundup of Rwandans in the town of Barara. And in Barara, one of the things that was said by one of the local politicians, the governor of Barara, was, "It is fitting to make Barara a springboard to spark off the spontaneous movement of regrouping the Rwandese refugees into designated settlement for proper and easy administration." Barara district did spontaneous movement of regrouping Rwandese refugees back to their settlement camps for the sake of peace and stability. It's difficult to keep a snake in the bed and you feel peaceful in your sleep. For the last 20 years, we've been generous enough to accommodate the Rwandese refugees, not knowing that we were nourishing a viper in our chest. Until recently, we realised they were dangerous criminals, killers, smugglers and saboteurs. When Armin took over the government in 1971, Rwandese refugees were recruited into the National Army. Those who did not join the army had full confidence in the Armin regime, claimed land, owned estates through dubious names. So many refugees paid the price for what Armin had done to instrumentalise those refugee populations. When we get into the Museveni period, it's worth recognising that many of Museveni's support structures mirror those of Armin. So, like Armin, Museveni has always historically lacked support from the Buganda population, has relied on support networks in the southwest of the country, where a lot of his Banya and Kole kinship networks are based, or in the West Nile area, where he's had particularly strong relationships with those along the Sudanese and South Sudanese border. So Museveni, in many ways, restored what Amin had been doing. He put back in place many of the settlement policies and supported what became the self-reliance policies. The difference is that Museveni managed to instrumentalise those vis-à-vis the donor community after the Cold War. So Museveni has packaged a lot of what preceded for donors. So in 1999, he developed the self-reliance strategy, celebrated by UNHCR and European donors. This became an initiative called ReHope in 2015 and became the comprehensive refugee response framework under UNHCR in 2019. A laundry list of acronyms have been used by the Ugandan government, working with the UN system, to reframe refugee self-reliance as a unique model, often framing it as something new when actually the legacy was built much earlier under authoritarian rule. Let's move to the second of these cases, Ethiopia. This is the story about how Mengistu's regime was often celebrated and feted by UNHCR for policies it adopted alongside otherwise repressive rule. It's worth again going back to the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And Ethiopia too hosted a large number of European refugees. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it hosted Greek, German East Europeans, and Yugoslav migrant workers who in many cases sought asylum and sanctuary in Ethiopia. For the early period, under Haile Selassie, Ethiopia was celebrated as a major ally of the United States in the West. John F. Kennedy described Ethiopia as its main ally in the region, saying, in the United States' view, Ethiopia was the key country in that part of the world. And until at least Mengistu's Derg regime, it was an ally of the United States. And until the late 1960s, Ethiopia hosted relatively few refugees. The Ethiopian Committee for Aid to Refugees was created under the joint leadership of the Emperor and UNHCR. But it wasn't until May 1969, with the military coup in Sudan that brought Colonel Jafar Nimeri to power, that refugees started to arrive in Ethiopia. And two groups really arrived from Sudan into Ethiopia. They were the Anwars, who were the Sufi religious followers of the traditional Mahdist regime, and the initial group who ruled in Sudan immediately after the end of British Empire, but also prior to British Empire, and the Anyanya, the Nilotic groups, Nuer, Dinka, etc., from South Sudan, that initially were referred to as the Anyanya, became basis of the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, and the SPLM. Those two groups ended up being deeply valued by the Selassie regime to the extent that something unthinkable happened. Selassie created exit controls, refusing to allow those refugees to go back to Sudan because they were so politically valuable, because they were thought of as a way of balancing against the Sudanese regime of Nimeri, that actually they offered opposition in exile and a way to discredit that regime, while simultaneously there was movement of Ethiopian refugees into Sudan, notably from Eritrea. In 1972, there was an agreement between Khartoum and southern Sudanese groups in Sudan called the Addis Ababa Agreement. And within that context, each government agreed to take measures to put an end to subversive activities. And as part of that, very temporarily, Ethiopia and Sudan agreed to stop supporting rebel groups on either side of the border. But this changed when we got to Mengistu. Mengistu seized power in 1974 and ruled to 1991. And initially, UNHCR refused to work with Mengistu. UNHCR wanted to support its major donor, the United States. And the United States' biggest ally in the region at that time was Sudan. The US wanted to work with Nimeri, and in doing so was suspicious of Mengistu. And UNHCR didn't want to discredit Sudan by acknowledging the presence of Sudanese refugees, whether the Anwars or the Anyanya, in Ethiopia. So UNHCR identified that for political reasons, it wouldn't recognise that Sudanese influx. Mengistu's government tried to persuade UNHCR. In UNHCR's words, the Minister of the Interior expressed the view that adequate land for cultivation would be made available to the refugees with the aim of making them self-supporting in food crops within a short period. To this end, spontaneous settlement would be encouraged. So gradually, in order to encourage UNHCR to provide funding, support, and discredit their Sudanese neighbours, Mengistu started to relax policies towards those Sudanese refugees. In 1976, UNHCR considered the Derg government's request for UNHCR recognition of those refugees and aid that could support southern Sudanese refugees in both Addis and the Gambela camps in the west of the country. There were claims that the government was misusing and siphoning off that money, but UNHCR continued to provide support. A lot of it was going into supporting Mengistu's villagisation policies, benefiting areas of the country where Mengistu had a stake in garnering national support. For instance, in supporting the Gambela camps, a lot of it was supporting infrastructure around Gambela that would benefit Anuaks, with whom the Derg had a challenging and problematic relationship. UNHCR's support supported not only refugee aid, but integrated development programs for the border regions, developing infrastructure and facilities that would also benefit the Derg and the host population. There were many interesting things we can find in the archival data at that time. For instance, the World Food Programme worked with Ethiopia on what it called a food for work scheme, basically suggesting that refugees would have to work in order to get food aid. And the logic was, and I quote, that the refugees are not more favoured by receiving food rations free of charge while the citizens have to work for food. And so a paradox emerged that between 1976 and 1978, at the peak of the Ethiopian Red Terror, when hundreds of thousands of people were being brutally massacred, interned and detained, Ethiopia started to work closely with UNHCR on its refugee policies. As bilateral rivalries emerged with Sudan and Somalia with the Ogaden War in 1977 and 78, leading to Somali refugees coming across the eastern border, refugees were valued as rebel groups. Initially, Sudanese rebel groups, but also Ogaden separatists, were supported in many of the refugee camps in the west and the east of the country. And by the end of 1978, UNHCR's Regional Liaison Office spoke positively about developments within Ethiopia. UNHCR claimed, under the circumstances, Ethiopian refugee situation can be viewed in a very positive light. Ethiopia follows a quite liberal policy. And Ethiopia provided work permits in cities. It offered de facto self-reliance opportunities in Gambela, and it benefited from a degree of international legitimacy and cover for the Red Paradox. Briefly in 1982, Ethiopia and Sudan tried to negotiate as the security situation at the border escalated. But in 1983, civil conflict in South Sudan reached a peak. The SPLA emerged, and the SPLA fled to the Gambela camps. Eritrean separatists had set up their main base in the Kassala refugee camps in Sudan, and on the other side of the border in Gambela, SPLA had militarized bases. So we know that in the 1980s, there was evidence of rear bases on both sides of those borders, both the Sudan-Ethiopia border and the Somalia-Ethiopia border. Mengistu said, with regard to the Sudan, unfortunately I have to say that Sudan has been used as the base for elements who for so many years have been engaged in banditry and acts of terrorism. And so at that point he was prepared to be brazen about using the Gambela camps to support the SPLA and the SPLA's actions to try to destabilise Nimyeri's regime in Sudan. UNHCR also noted the refugee situation in Ethiopia cannot be divorced from the general political situation. Movements whose objectives are to topple or destabilise the accredited governments of the countries of the Horn receive overt and covert support from governments. The refugees are hapless outcomes and victims: abductions, abusive detention, arbitrary arrests, harassment, intimidation, and food diversion reportedly carried out by SPLA elements. I think what's also interesting, finally, is to note what happened when the Derg regime was overthrown in the early 90s. In the immediate aftermath, protection collapsed, and UNHCR lamented that without the Derg in power, there was instability and a lack of access to refugee camps in both the Gambela region and areas like Hati Sheikh, some of the biggest Somali hosting refugee camps in the east. So immediately, in the aftermath, we saw that shift. Now, the regime that took over and the transitional government of Ethiopia gradually managed to develop control and a relationship with UNHCR. But what's clear is that there had been a degree of stability around the relationship with UNHCR and those refugee camps. Whether we call it liberal is another question. If we move to Sudan, the other side of that border relationship that I've just described, it's also worth saying that Nyerere was celebrated for many of his refugee policies. Just to say something about pre-Nyerere Sudan. Sudan became independent in 1956. Between 1964 and 1967, southern Sudanese refugee numbers in neighbouring countries increased dramatically to 125,000. There was suppression of their rights and opportunities. There was internal armed conflict that involved southern Sudanese people. And the Anyanya militia moved across to Gambela, where they could access weapons, arms, and engage in cross-border incursions. But one of the other things that happened simultaneously was in 1967, the Eritrean War of Independence began. And Eritrean refugees moved across to the Sudanese side of the border and the Kassala refugee camps that continue to the present day. The Eritrean Liberation Front developed one of its main offices in that context. Now, a puzzle emerges that between 1969 and 1984, Nyerere also adopted a lot of seemingly progressive refugee policies. Refugee rights were enshrined in the country's constitution. The right to work, education, and freedom of movement were adopted. Some refugees even received naturalization. So many Eritrean refugees, not only working from Kassala, were welcomed in Khartoum, integrated in Khartoum, became government civil servants in Khartoum, and served the country. Nyerere was also positioning himself in the context of the regional Cold War. So as the Cold War took a hold in terms of proxy conflicts from the 1970s, and the US backed Sudan, Nyerere was able to engage in extraversion, to access money, and arm militias with US and Western funding to destabilise the Derg. Nyerere secured the financial support of UNHCR and its biggest donor, the United States. One of the quotes from 1970 from UNHCR is the Ethiopian authorities were suspecting the Sudanese authorities of trying to infiltrate refugee groups in the Gambela area by sending agents into their midst. So Sudan sending essentially spies across the border to assassinate or intimidate or understand the mobilization of Anyanya refugees in western Ethiopia. The Sudanese authorities have for the last 2 months been suspecting the Ethiopian authorities of sending agents from Ethiopia into the refugee camps around Kassala. These infiltrations have apparently been stopped at the border, which resulted in serious clashes between Sudanese and Ethiopian forces. It's worth noting that from 1974, Sudanese and Ethiopian rivalry deepened with the Cold War, and the US aligned against Mengistu. The US simultaneously discovered oil in Sudan, and Sudan gave Chevron access to oil concessions. The Derg ended the US-Selassie relationship that had preceded it, and US military aid to Sudan flowed. UNHCR's budget in Sudan was a massive part of its overall Africa budget. UNHCR had noted in 1973 that the overall protection situation in Sudan is generally quite satisfactory. Several steps have been taken towards the adoption of more satisfactory legislation on behalf of refugees on Sudanese territory. It's the only legislative instrument of its kind in English-speaking Africa, UNHCR celebrated. Sudan signed the 1951 convention. It adopted self-reliance programs for rural refugees, creating settlements, building infrastructure, building schools. And by 1978, it offered the largest education scholarship program for refugees anywhere in Africa. But alongside this, there was continued evidence of militarization. So in 1977, on the 1st of January, Nyerere proclaimed that the continuation of plotting against the Sudan through the Ethiopian land may lead us to utilise the hundreds of thousands who are living in the Sudan from Ethiopia and Eritrea to export unrest and problems to them. If we want, we may use all that huge number to create unrest to the ruling Ethiopian junta. So being really vocal about using refugees as a bilateral threat. UNHCR also noted that although the fronts, EPLF and ELF, the main Eritrean oppositions in exile, do not maintain military camps inside the Sudan, the EPLF and ELF maintain offices there and virtually all Eritrean supplies for war. It is astonishing how UNHCR saw military infrastructure such as these offices and depots, which were, as UNHCR said, held virtually all Eritrean supplies for the war, but yet refused to see any military camps in these refugee settlements. So moving on, Rwanda, and particularly the Kayibanda regime from 1962 to 1973. I think what defines Rwandan refugee policy since independence is the ethnic relationship between supposed Hutus and Tutsis right since the 1950s. At the end of the late 1950s, over 100,000 Tutsis fled Rwanda after the overthrow of the Tutsi monarchy. In Rwanda, by 1965, Burundi had also experienced an unsuccessful Hutu coup. And many of those Hutus who had attempted to carry out a coup fled to Rwanda. So Rwanda was receiving Burundian Hutu refugees. And Kayibanda initially welcomed them. Kayibanda wanted to strike a balance of not destabilising the relationship with Burundi, not creating a bilateral conflict with Burundi, but simultaneously wanting to support Hutus, having domestic backing to support Hutus, and recognising the presence of Hutu refugees from Burundi as an opportunity. Those Hutu refugees were given opportunities to integrate, settle, and access jobs. And this contrasted with Congolese refugees fleeing Mobutu's Zaire. Those fleeing from what's today the Democratic Republic of Congo were quickly returned back to Mobutu, where many of them faced execution. In contrast, the Burundian refugees were welcomed. And those Burundian refugees were an important part of the regime. Particularly between the early 70s and the early 80s, there was a militarization that took place, as we've seen in the other countries, of Burundian refugees in Rwanda. The Relima Reception Centre was, quote, a swampy, mosquito-infested area halfway between Kigali and the Burundian border, but it was used to arm and support many of the Burundian refugees. UNHCR noted in 1973 that the Rwandese refugees who were in Burundi are being armed not with spears and arrows and machetes, but with modern weapons. They receive army training and support and are being brought to the nearest border and held in reserve for a counterattack. Simultaneously, the response from Rwanda was to arm Burundian refugees, but also to offer them opportunities to integrate. They were given access to agricultural tools, rural settlement programs, and the chance to integrate. Habyarimana's period of supposedly liberal refugee policy took hold particularly between 1973 and 81. UNHCR again described the policy as, I quote, open and liberal. Rwanda gave refugees the right to education and the right to work. UNHCR claimed they were not discriminated against in receiving their salaries, the legal minimum being assured. Rwanda joined the 1951 Convention on Refugees and the OAU Convention in 1979. UNHCR noted in 1973 that in fact a relatively high number of refugees from Burundi have readily found employment both in various sectors of public administration and in the private economy. The main reason for such a liberal policy undoubtedly has been a need for qualified personnel. So there's a labour migration element to it as well as a security element. By acceding to these conventions, our country, said the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which is a member of the UN and the OAU, is simply associating itself with the other signatory states in a spirit of solidarity, so seeking the conferral of legitimacy of the international system. In contrast, not adhering to these conventions suggests that our mentality on this issue has not changed in 16 years. So a real desire to assert a shift in adopting more progressive policies. It's therefore important to strengthen our credibility on the international stage. What was interesting, though, is that Habyarimana shifted and turned back from 1981. Rather than continuing to embrace integrated settlement, Habyarimana offered a dual stream for different types of refugee. Different types of camp were set up. The so-called pacifists were sent to camps in Mutara with agricultural opportunity, and militants, so-called militants, were sent to the restructured Relima settlement, which was more of a closed camp. So they started dividing refugees into those pacifists, allies of the regime, that would get access to jobs and support, and those who were seen as militants, who might be a threat. So this policy meant that overall, while there were no restrictions on work, agriculture, movement, and access to education, Habyarimana didn't want to be seen as destabilising the region, and from the 1980s wanted to work with Obote and then Museveni constructively, rather than be seen to be destabilising neighbouring regimes. So in summary, similarly to our other cases, Rwanda under Habyarimana was interested in attracting followers, recruiting Hutus from the Burundi refugee population and supporting access to workers for underpopulated areas. In terms of weapons, destabilising Burundi, but also managing the RPF threat from Uganda and attracting money from the US and UNHCR, particularly into the northern part of the country where Habyarimana had much of his base. I think what's rather troubling is the implications potentially for the Rwandan genocide. This is a sub-part of the story that's particularly interesting, that Habyarimana was very selective in some of the policies around refugees, very concerned to continue to destabilise and view the Rwandan Patriotic Front, what emerged as Kagame's army and military regime in Uganda, while simultaneously being very selective in the response to different refugees in the country. And there's a sub-story to that, which I won't go into now, where an argument can be made that some of these refugee policies contributed to the dynamics of the civil war in Rwanda, the cross-border dynamics, and what ensued. So I think I've probably given you enough empirical material to begin to flesh out that case. I think what I want to conclude with is how this matters in the contemporary context. And I want to suggest that what I've shown is that there is something of a paradox, that very often authoritarian governments adopt policies that are perceived by the international community as progressive for refugees. Very often, and surprisingly, some of the worst authoritarian regimes have assumed over history policies that include and integrate refugees, at least on a socio-economic level. But what do we do with this? What do we do with the idea that on some levels, authoritarian regimes may be easier to work with than liberal democracies when it comes to refugee rights? The policy conclusion from this is not, let's encourage authoritarianism and let's oppose liberal democracy. That would be an absurd policy recommendation. But neither should it be, let's go out and celebrate the regimes that adopt these policies in ways that arguably have happened in the past through UNHCR and other organisations, and arguably continue today. There is a normative dilemma about what we do with these insights. And it plays out, for instance, with the proposed UK-Rwanda removals deal that we saw under the previous government, which has been emulated recently by the Dutch government in almost copying the UK-Rwanda deal in approaching Uganda and suggesting that failed asylum seekers in the Netherlands, regardless of nationality and region of origin, be sent to Uganda, and recognising that Uganda is a progressive country in terms of its refugee policies, and therefore a space in which refugees could access all of their rights. The danger, if we conclude that authoritarian regimes are progressive and do so uncritically, is that we may legitimate such deals. I'd suggest, on the contrary, we need to understand the complex politics that underlies the motivation of these governments and regimes. And that's where in our work we're also trying to unpack the dynamics that underlie some of these contemporary regimes. That if we know the motivation is to attract followers, money, and weapons, we should perhaps be more sceptical, but know that the playbook of how we understand and analyse the politics of these countries needs to be quite different from often the naive one-size-fits-all playbook that we assume when we think about what's motivating these prospective partner states. So 5 quick conclusions. The first, there is something of an illiberal paradox here. Building on Katerina Natta's ideas applied to labour migration more generally, it's clear that today and in the past, many regimes have adopted policies, albeit for instrumental reasons very often, and reasons that support staying in power, assume policies that have been widely celebrated as liberal. UNHCR has a really interesting and challenging role in the story I've just portrayed. That at different times UNHCR has claimed that the 4 regimes we've discussed have liberal refugee policies, has had effects on legitimating those regimes. Now, we can find examples of how that plays out in the contemporary era, some of which I've alluded to. So how should an organisation like UNHCR engage with authoritarian regimes? It's in a very difficult position. It relies on its main donor states that have bilateral relationships with those authoritarian governments, and it relies on many authoritarian regimes around the world to keep their borders open, host refugees, and be willing to have refugees operate on their territory. So UNHCR isn't an organisation that can go around criticising authoritarian regimes openly, but equally, how can it think about its language so as not to celebrate and legitimate? What's the playbook for advocacy and influence in these regimes? Well, being aware of some of the normative dilemmas and cross-cutting challenges, how do we use this to be aware of the levers and motivations that underpin authoritarian states' refugee policies? What does that mean when we think about Iran and Pakistan hosting large numbers of Afghan refugees? What does it mean when we think about states across Latin America hosting Venezuelan refugees? What does it mean when we look at other parts of the African continent about how we think about our engagement and influence at the national level, but also potentially at local levels where patronage is often at play? And what implications does this have for European asylum deals? What implications does it have for their legitimacy, but also understanding what's enabled and made possible, what the answer to the how has this become possible question when we think about things like the UK Rwanda deal and the Dutch Uganda deal, alongside Spain's bilateral relationships with Morocco, Italy's relationship with Libya, the European Union's bilateral partnerships on asylum and migration. And why is this more broadly relevant? Well, potentially because there's a blurring of the line between democracy and authoritarianism. Because as we see the threat of democratic backsliding in our own countries, and we see the rise of populist nationalism, are our own asylum policies, are our own embedded liberal norms and practices under threat? And are we, the liberal democratic West, that celebrate our liberal democratic status, also in danger of sliding in the direction of authoritarianism and embracing some of the dynamics and motivations for refugee hosting that have been present in Sudan, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Uganda? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Alex, for that really interesting and insightful presentation. And yeah, it's such an innovative work that you're doing, looking at kind of like the archives, being the first kind of like non-Ugandans who are able to look at their archives. That's really interesting, and working with refugees who have lived experience. I think the methodology of your research is fascinating, but also, of course, the substance. I think, it's there's so much to say. I'm trying to kind of like think about where to start, but it's such a fascinating subject. So thank you very much for that. I have a couple of reactions on your presentation, and with those reactions come questions as well that I'd love to hear your answers to, and then we'll open up the questions to the audience. I think my first kind of like reaction is on kind of like how you're looking at the shift in policies in these kind of like authoritarian states. And if I may draw from my own research, I think this is really interesting because in East Africa, right, as you say, there's a lot of progressive, so-called liberal policies in terms of hosting refugees. You've mentioned Uganda, but also you didn't mention it in your talk, but it's in your book, The Wealth of Refugees, the policy in Kenya, which is considered to be, one of the on paper, it has one of the harshest or most restrictive law for refugees, where refugees are basically encamped, not allowed to move, not allowed to work. But recently, this has shifted. Recently, they're trying to think of integrating refugees and allowing them to work and to move. I was intrigued at first when I saw the title of your talk about authoritarian states, because my own research in Kenya looks at how markets emerge in refugee camps, and a body of literature that I'm actually drawing from is how markets emerge in so-called authoritarian communist states. So how black markets emerge in places like China, Vietnam, and North Korea. And one of the scholarship that I draw from is the scholarship of everyday politics, where they talk about, even before the policy shift happens. So, for example, in China, even before they formalize the household responsibility system, where individual households can do the farming, or even in Vietnam, where households can also profit from their own farms, there's already this kind of like reality of people doing that even before the formal policy shift. And so I think, I wanted to bring this in because it complements your work of looking at the broader policy shifts across history, but also if you look at what's happening on the ground, there's already kind of like refugees. When you talk about these countries where they're not allowed to work, refugees are already working anyway, or refugees are already setting up in their businesses. And you also talk about this in your other book, Refugee Economies, where even in newly established camps, refugees are already trading and already setting up businesses. So I think that's my first comment. My second comment is, I think I love how you framed it as, authoritarian regimes that enact liberal policies in welcoming refugees. I do wonder what you think about this concept of liberal humanitarianism. So some scholars of humanitarian studies argue that there's this concept of liberal humanitarianism, and they say that largely humanitarian intervention in the world, which is mainly composed of international NGOs and multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the UN, they stem from kind of like the liberal logic of the West, where they promote values of democracy, but also kind of like free markets. And in terms of refugee intervention in particular, a lot of humanitarian aid tries to see individuals like refugees as economically productive contributors to society. Some critical scholars argue that donors and Western governments, liberal democracies, are leveraging their international aid to advance their kind of like liberal ideology. And so I'm wondering, to what extent do you think is this not exactly a paradox, but in fact the triumph of liberal humanitarianism, that it's actually consistent with what scholars are saying as the liberal humanitarianism that stems from the global north or stems from liberal democracies? Because it is instrumentalized, as you've shown in the examples that you've mentioned earlier. A lot of the authoritarian governments were responsive to the levers and the incentives that were being presented to them by donors, or for example, UNHCR. And you've mentioned one of the motivations for them is money, so international aid. And so it seems like this is being instrumentalized to further this liberal humanitarianism. So I wonder, to what extent do you think that's applicable? My third reaction is, you've brought up that this was, building on the paradox of liberal states enacting illiberal policies within their own border. And so you're flipping almost the question of how illiberal states are now enacting liberal refugee policies within their own borders. But it seems to me there's kind of like a double paradox here almost, because liberal Western democracies, they're seen as they're seen as the champion of liberal humanitarianism, and yet, as you mentioned, they have illiberal policies when it comes to their own borders. So they will support liberal policies in humanitarianism elsewhere, providing funding for special economic zones and providing jobs and freedom of movement for refugees, and supporting countries, authoritarian countries that do. And yet at the same time, when it comes to their own borders, they refuse to do the same thing. So, and this is a very live issue, as you've mentioned. In the UK's plan to send refugees to Rwanda, now the Netherlands plan to send refugees to Uganda, and even recently, with the UK government's plan to stop considering refugee applications or asylum-seeking applications from people in Syria. So I wonder, to what extent do you think this is a function of, humanitarianism within and outside of a country's borders, right? Because it seems like there's a difference there. My fourth reaction is around geography. So I think it's really fascinating how you talked about regime types and how that influences policies around refugee reception. And so I do wonder, to what extent do you think your insights are applicable to countries outside of East Africa that may be considered authoritarian as well? So I'm thinking countries that are within migration corridors, or neighboring countries of places that are experiencing conflict and with lots of refugee influx. So for example, Nicaragua in Latin America, which is also considered by Freedom House, for example, as not free. But also other so-called authoritarian states that may not be part of neighboring regions with refugee influx, like maybe China and Russia. And to what extent are your insights applicable to these contexts? But also, what should we do, given your insights? Should we advocate for countries like China and Russia to take their burden-sharing responsibilities as well in terms of hosting refugees? And finally, my last comment, and you mentioned this as well, is around advocacy. And assistance, right? And it's, especially for a lot of us here who perhaps would want to work for international NGOs in future, whether that's in program or in policies, given this knowledge that authoritarian states are kind of like instrumentalizing, in a way, refugees for their own benefit, you say followers, weapons, and money, what then are we to think of the ethics of advocacy in this regard? Because obviously we can't. It's probably not best if we go to these authoritarian states and say, "Oh, you should welcome refugees because that'll give you followers, weapons, and money." But also, I'm thinking about the humanitarian principles, right? Humanitarian principles are so, for example, neutrality and impartiality, they're often invoked so that international NGOs have access to populations who are in need. and humanitarian diplomacy as well, so that, international NGOs would say, we're not gonna meddle or not gonna care whether or not you're authoritarian, because we're neutral or we're impartial, as long as you give us access to refugee populations so we can provide humanitarian aid to them. But this idea of humanitarian principle is now being challenged, right? Especially by voices in the global south who say that humanitarian principles are sometimes used in the spirit of colonialism, or how can you say that you're impartial or neutral in the face of atrocities like genocide, and we see this happening now as well in Gaza. So yeah, I wonder what you think about the ethics around advocacy and assistance. I think I'll stop there with my reactions, and James can help us take questions from the audience. But yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Arbie, and of course, Alex, thank you. Yeah, so I'm not going to, I want to ask, but I'll wait first, and let's collect some responses from the students. So what I suggest is we get a couple of questions, and then you can come back as well to Arbie's remarks. So, right in the back.
Thank you. Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I was going to ask, right at the beginning, you mentioned the demographic triangle and how that looks different in different places. And I think alluding to the fact that for a lot of global north countries, we're currently not at replacement rate in terms of our population structure. And I think so far the populist position in these countries has been a move towards more kind of pro-natalist policies. Which I'm a reproductive rights person, so I'm interested and concerned about that. But I'm wondering from what you said at the end, whether you see an increased interest in liberalizing refugee policies as another kind of potential policy response to this, and whether you have any kind of broad observations on how you've seen pro-immigration policies interact with kind of reproductive or pro-natalist policies. Thank you.
Okay. Can I see your hands again? Sorry. Yeah, how about right down here?
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. 8 years ago, I had an opportunity to watch your TED Talk on YouTube back in Bangkok. So it's very, delightful to see you in person today. So my question is that, in the talk, I remember you talked about the globalization, how we can build a kind of globalization that works for everyone, and it is very related to the issue of migration as well. I don't know whether until this time you already find, the globalization framework that seem to work well for everyone, refugees, migrant people as well, and in that talk you seem to have high hope for liberal democracy. So my question is, do you still have high hope in liberal democracy? And my second question is that it is about the notion of self-sufficiency. As you know, is a dominant framework when we talk about the issue of refugee, it's become a dominant framework adopted by UNHCR. So my question is there any alternative to the self-sufficiency framework, refugee as business person, refugee as entrepreneurs? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hold your question. We'll have not too long answers, but since you also have Arbie to respond to.
I'll be really quick on these two. I think the demographic side is really interesting. It should be a really powerful political argument to say we have population needs, we have labour immigration needs, we have ageing populations. Refugees are a potential solution to that. They bring skills, they bring talents, they can fill gaps, low-skilled, high-skilled. It makes sense. I think there's more of a move to recognise labour migration pathways, so-called complementary pathways for refugees to access labour migration visas, to access higher education, and to blur the boundaries a bit between refugee status and labour migration. But I think what has been missing is a really strong, robust argument that links to those sorts of demographic arguments about actually where are our birth rates, where are our death rates, where does that replacement come in, and connect that. So I think there's a gap there in terms of the political conversation and thinking about the framing of that. In terms of inclusive globalization, I mean, that was in the context of the Brexit TED talk I gave. And I think one of the claims I made was that there was a systematic scapegoating of immigration debates, and that was a major feature of what led to Brexit. And I think one of the things is that very often the regions that are most pro-immigration are the regions with the highest levels of immigration, and those that are most anti-immigration are those that have relatively low levels of immigration, but where there's been deindustrialization and shifts in economic opportunity for people who feel disenfranchised are much harder for politicians to narrate, or politicians are much less willing to narrate those economic realities than they are to scapegoat people with faces, it's because of immigration, than to say automation and offshoring, the loss of industrial jobs and labour-intensive manufacturing to East Asia, to automation, is a reality of the global economy, and we've got to adapt to it. And so I think we could probably revisit Holyfield's liberal paradox. It's not inevitable that we have that paradox. It's not inevitable that voting and majoritarianism should be anti-refugee. It depends on how it's framed, and it depends on political leadership. And that political leadership is partly about diagnosing the very real socioeconomic challenges that a lot of people feel disenfranchised by, but are not being well explained by our politicians, who go too easily to an anti-immigration perspective. I mean, in terms of what you said about the sort of refugee as entrepreneur narrative, I think we've got to get the right balance. So under the right circumstances, refugees can be contributors to our societies. Economically, socially, culturally, diversity is greatly enriching. That includes the economic side, entrepreneurship, but also self-employment, employees. I think what we need to do is recognise the importance of that pathway. So we know from research we've done in East Africa, but also research that other scholars like Dirk Bansack and others have done in Europe, that one of the biggest determinants of host communities' willingness to accept refugees is whether they're seen as economic contributors or an economic burden. So the right to work, the opportunity to work, can have an influence on the politics, and the framing is really important. So we shouldn't be instrumentalising refugees and saying we value them because of their economic contribution, but equally recognising that they also bring skills and talents and aspirations, and we can benefit from their presence, I think is an important part of the argument, whether we're talking about liberal democratic states or authoritarian states. Shall I respond to Arbie
Yes,
now?
I think that's a good idea.
I'll try to be brief. Brilliant set of
I
comments.
haven't forgotten you.
I won't do justice to all of them. Firstly, the everyday politics. I think there's a story here about the localization of authoritarian politics. I've dealt with it very much at the sort of capital city level, but I think it's also really interesting to think about the stories that play out in border hosting hinterlands, how they play out in the everyday lives of refugees, but also host communities. So some of the really interesting archival research was the work we did in areas like the Nachivali settlement, the oldest continuous refugee settlement in Africa, where we've got records going out back that tell us about land disputes, that tell us about the realities of very local politics and the backlashes we see at that level, the role of patronage and how it plays out locally, who's bought off on what basis. And a lot of the story of refugee politics, as I've argued elsewhere, is not what happens at the capital city level, it's what happens locally in particular contexts. So, Arbie, you've done 9 months of really fascinating research in the Kakuma refugee camps in Kenya. And as you know, that Turkana County context is quite different from politics in Nairobi. It connects to and feeds off politics in Nairobi. In some ways, you've had a history of more progressive leadership within the county, but in other ways, you've had a series of vested interests. You've had political ambition, you've had corruption, you've had patronage, you've had different forms of influence. So I think that the localization of authoritarian politics is a piece of the story that also needs to be fleshed out. In terms of your second point about liberal humanitarianism, I think this is a lot about authoritarian regimes playing the liberal institutionalist game. And in a way, this is reinserting the agency of the African state back into the story. That this isn't just about a sort of neoliberal story of Western states pushing their ideas and norms about market-based humanitarianism on the South, but actually throughout history, these regimes have had agency. They've played the liberal internationalist game for gain, and in many ways, liberal internationalists have been naive in understanding and interpreting that, assuming that they control all of the structural levers and control the refugee regime, where what it does and what it's used for also involves the agency of politicians and leaders from the global south in ways that we shouldn't underestimate. And if we do, we play into that liberal humanitarian idea. It also challenges, as you do in your work, the idea of refugee self-reliance, because all of these regimes have policies that might be described as self-reliance policies. Now, what's interesting across East Africa is where you have self-reliance policies, they don't necessarily translate into self-reliance. Self-reliance is defined by UNHCR as refugees' ability to live independently of aid, individually at household level, at community level. When we look at most of these camps and settlements where refugee self-reliance policies are adopted, most refugees are not self-reliant on those terms, but the policies lead to development aid for those countries and for their politicians that contribute to patronage and benefit everyone, often except the refugee populations. So I think there's a really interesting story where if we add this in, it contributes to that more critical approach to humanitarian development nexus, self-reliance, who wins, who loses. In terms of liberal democratic hypocrisy, there's this element of organised hypocrisy, and we can debate how we respond to the protect here or protect there debate. The reality is that most of the world's refugees are hosted in immediate neighbouring countries that neighbour conflict and crisis. In an ideal ethical framework, you would have greater redistribution of those populations, and rich countries with the means to host refugees would probably host far more refugees and resettlement numbers would be higher. In a more constrained, non-ideal world, there are interesting dilemmas about how we respond. We can recognise that clearly there is that organised hypocrisy. The question is what we then do with that. And it leads to your final question about what does advocacy mean? As I said, clearly advocacy isn't about celebrating authoritarian regimes and the instrumentalisation of refugees, but what do we do with that? I hope what we do is have a more informed ethical conversation, and an ethical conversation that engages meaningfully in the trade-offs. That actually, if we see that the real motivation of many of these states with supposedly progressive policies is not primarily about refugee rights, is not primarily about refugee protection, but there are alternative agendas, at least by recognising and calling out those agendas, we can engage meaningfully in understanding what the trade-offs are. That part of celebrating Museveni's policies around refugee rights is also legitimating, endorsing many of the other practices of that regime, strengthening that regime, and there are knock-on consequences of that that we would regard to be ethically negative. Equally, even if we look at the consequences in the refugee regime, what are the trade-offs? What do we entrench? What do we legitimate? What's actually doing good for refugees by celebrating those self-reliance policies? And can we look more critically at the practices on the ground and the localisation of how these play out if we understand the politics at the national level more critically, even if it's quite a sobering story? And in terms of the geography, I haven't done the research yet. I think there's a question here about what is regime type and what is specific to the history of this region. And those are questions that it would be really interesting to explore. Latin America is quite interesting. Central America in the Cold War, some of those same dynamics. Honduras, Nicaragua, like Sudan, Ethiopia, different sides of the US-Soviet alignment, different degrees of legitimation, also early stage self-reliance policies celebrated in the International Conference on Refugees in Central America of 1989. And then today, support for self-reliance in countries like Colombia for Venezuelan refugees, with interesting payoffs legitimating the government in particular ways. So interesting things to draw upon. And I think the question is, I've focused on quite a material explanation of benefit to regimes, ideology, ideas, what role do they play? So thank you for the great comments.
Great, thanks. Arbie, if you don't mind, we go back to the floor, right? I'm holding back myself. So there's a cluster here. How about you first? There. No, in the back.
Thank you. Over here, sorry. I'm from Ethiopia, so this really resonates a lot. My grandfather had to walk to Sudan during the Gay Shipper, like Red Terror, so this is really relevant. But I wanted to ask, in your research, have you seen any sort of records around the dissonance that the UN agencies had around the 1983 to 85 famine, kind of ignoring the political kind of origins of that, while also sort of supporting the refugee policies of the regime? Just curious to see if that's something that they privately acknowledged or sort of ignored as a part of this sort of process.
Okay.
Thank you.
And how about just in front of you? There.
Hi. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about two cases that you haven't touched much on, which is Kenya, which you've mentioned a little, and Tanzania, and particularly how it fits within your ideas, thinking about Kenya being a more liberal democracy and yet increasingly becoming more open, maybe second to Uganda, having the most liberal policies, despite maybe having to deal with the political capital problem you're talking about. And then also Tanzania, where it's kind of the opposite. It's increasingly been moving towards authoritarianism, and yet their policies are extremely exclusive towards refugees, and so how that fits into your kind of
Thank you.
thesis.
Did I see somebody over here on this side? Yeah, right in the back, the woman in the back.
Hello, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. My own PhD looked at the lived realities of self-reliance policies in Uganda, so my question is very Uganda focused. But if I understand correctly your argument, you're saying that when UNHCR upholds the policies of authoritarian states and calls them liberal, by consequence, they are upholding authoritarian regimes at large. I mean, from my own research, that resonates a lot. What I'm wondering is, in Uganda specifically, what we've seen recently is a very...
Could you talk a little bit more?
Oh, sorry. Is this better? Okay.
Yes.
In Uganda, there's a very well-acknowledged at this point failure of the self-reliance policies by and large. I wonder if you think that that this acknowledgement will in turn weaken the authoritarian regime, or not, because that doesn't seem to be the case so far. Thank you.
Okay, I think we should allow you brief answers so that we can get another round in, at least, maybe a couple.
So I haven't looked in depth at UN archival work and UN politics around the 83-85 famine. I mean, it comes up, it runs through the archives, and there is stuff within, say, UNHCR archives on that period. I've mainly looked at the lens of Gambella, and as it starts to emerge towards the end of that period, the presence of Somali refugees, increasingly post-Ogaden War, and so haven't focused on it, but there is material there in the UNHCR archives, which would be well worth looking at. So something I've not really done, but really interesting as a question. Kenya and Tanzania. I mean, there's an argument to say, let's start with Tanzania. There's an argument to say that actually Tanzania partly fits the story. So Julius Nyerere, socialist authoritarianism, generous, open, self-reliant policies for a long period of time, and celebrated policies for different stages, Burundian refugees, Congolese refugees. But then when we get to the 90s, as people like James Milner and others have documented, democratization and structural adjustment take place, and elections contribute to backlash and an anti-refugee narrative, including the expulsion of Rwandans fleeing Rwandan genocide and its aftermath. And what we see is people like Magufuli starting to shift towards all of the traits of populist nationalism. So really trying to get national support from a support base by having a hard-line, securitized position. So we end up sort of, I think, with a complicated position where we get some of the traits of populist nationalism, some of the shift back to authoritarianism, but against the backdrop of weakening democracy. And so maybe this is an argument that actually weakening democracies are in a slightly different position. And that's kind of what we see across the West, where populist nationalism and democratic backsliding are clearly not the friends of refugees. And that's a different position than these perhaps stable authoritarian regimes, well, not stable internally, but stable in terms of governance and regime type. But I think it certainly adds interesting nuance. Kenya, I mean, really interesting. Arbie pointed to the sort of shifts. So the new refugee legislation that ostensibly is about making some of the de facto right to work, de facto socioeconomic rights part of the legislation. I think there's a question about how sincere or disingenuous different parts of the government are around that. I mean, they sort of said, okay, we're going to close Kakuma and Dadaab, and then we're going to shift to something that looks more like self-reliance policy. They're not going to be able to close Kakuma and Dadaab anytime soon, both for domestic political reasons and because of pressure from the international community to keep them open. But equally, they're certainly not implementing anything especially liberal at the moment in terms of access to work permits. So accessing a work permit as a degree-educated refugee in Nairobi is extremely difficult. Notionally, it's available, but the practice is very different. Kenya, I mean, I said at the outset during Onspholic, I wanted to create this sort of binary understanding of authoritarian versus democratic. Kenya is defined as kind of partly free by Freedom House and others. I think for my purposes, it is probably towards the democratic end, because I think we can say that at least some of the elections are broadly free and fair, albeit that is on the spectrum. And equally, we see some of the, I think we see generally an absence of socioeconomic rights in particular because of democratic fears, because of the way in which particularly the Somali threat to security is narrated within popular public debate. Uganda, I mean, interesting question. I think whether self-reliance is failing or not is an open question. I realise the practice of self-reliance is seen as really challenging, particularly around access to land. So that idea of arable land available to all refugees in settlements in Uganda, not there. But what Uganda still has is significant freedom of movement for refugees, very high numbers of refugees being hosted, very positive rhetoric around refugee debates, and Museveni wanting to speak positively internationally to enable him to continue with that extroversion, attract international development aid. And it's interesting that European donors, the World Bank, UNHCR are still right behind UNHCR. The Dutch approach to Uganda, I think, underscores that Uganda is seen as a sort of safe and legitimating bet for international partnership. The reality on the ground is very different. The reality on the ground is not that settlements are thriving, they're struggling. There are land disputes, they've been there for a while, but the patronage politics is there. But this sort of future counterfactual scenario you articulate of, let's say the self-reliance policy is delegitimated, does collapse, would that hurt and harm Museveni's regime, and if so, to what extent? Don't know, but it's a really interesting counterfactual scenario to consider.
Arbie, do you want to add something on Kenya? Or should I go back to the floor? Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. You're absolutely right. I think in Kenya, there is a lot of kind of like shifts in the legislation, but I think there is a difference between policy formulation and policy implementation, right? Like the policy formulation, you think that it's really sound. They have the Refugee Act or the Refugee Law in 2021, and now they have this so-called Shirika Plan, which is a way to kind of like implement and operationalize this new progressive refugee law that they made. But when you speak to people on the ground, that people are very skeptical, and they say, oh, it's probably going to take 5-10 more years before it actually gets off. Which is why, you know, personally for my own PhD, my interest was with what's already happening, you know, despite the absence of the Sharika plan and despite the absence of the implementation of the policies, there is already a thriving economy in Kakuma camp. You know, it's the 10th largest urban area in Kenya. So it's it is really fascinating. So yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's see. Right in front of you, Maya. Okay.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. So on the topic of liberal democracy and the liberal paradox, I wanted to give some context. So I've lived in Canada for 8 years, and I had a question on, I guess, the flip side of things. So acknowledging, you know, as you mentioned, the various skills and talents that refugees bring, how do we also work to combat the perverse racism that seems to play a huge role in like the strained integration of refugees? So for example, you have a lot of, you know, you may have a lot of like asylum seekers or refugees from the medical field who have extensive experience in their home countries and designations, but then those don't translate really well in their new home countries, or they kind of make them recertify for years and spend time and money that they don't really have. So it kind of pushes them into these more lower skilled occupations, which I think only helps to fuel the narrative that why are we letting people in who only do low skilled jobs, or why are we not bringing, I guess, people who can contribute more meaningfully to the economy? That sort of, some of that semi, I guess, I don't know if I'd call it nationalist, but yeah, sort of that right-wing political views on refugees being like low-skilled, for example.
Okay, thank you. Can we come down here? The gentleman in the coat.
Thank you. So my question was just, I'm curious about the genealogy of the dynamic you're describing. So is it the case that there happen to be refugees because the neighborhood is pretty unsafe, and this was a resource that these authoritarian leaders realized they could exploit? Or is it the case that the authoritarian leaders recognize that sort of refugee camps or refugee settlements or refugee programs were desirable and have encouraged their formation? And I think that might be particularly interesting, firstly in relation to the stuff you said about this potential for this kind of dynamic in Europe, and then also secondly with what's happening now in like South Sudan with SPLM North in Sudan and their relationship with Ethiopia and the conflicts that are happening there. So yeah, what are your thoughts on those?
Thank you. Can I see again who is still anxious? Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Betts. I'm from ODID, so good to see a familiar face here. I specifically studied genocide stories and genocide narratives in Namibia. So I have a quick question about framings and narratives for these authoritarian regime states. Particularly, I'm interested in, I guess, and I'm from Canada, so I think about how we have positioned ourselves as like a place of refuge, a country of refuge for the past few decades. And I was wondering, how do these states kind of position themselves on the world stage, despite their maybe reputations as authoritarian regimes? How do they use their refugee, I guess, quite progressive policies to then combat that reputation, and what type of narratives do they use to combat that? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to turn to you, but I'm just going to slip in my my brief thing. And so that's first. Should we really be surprised that certain right-wing, or authoritarian regimes enlist refugees as a source of support? Just as they do very often recruit their armies from very particular regions of the country, because they then have leverage over these people, and these people exist in a dependent relationship with the regime. And they get the added benefit of saying, we're doing something for the international community, a legitimacy boost. So I'm just, I think it makes a lot of sense that they're doing it, rather than it being a big paradox. And then on the other hand, the other thing I would raise is that it's a little bit response to Arbie's second to last point, but also addressing what you said. There is a shift, I would have thought, with right populist politics in the attack on our, still embryonic, but international law that supposedly liberal democracies have subscribed to welcome refugees. We have an obligation to do it. And this is under attack by the politics of Trump, AFD, now even CDU. We saw that the day after Assad fell, there's big calls. Go back. We should now send them back, send the Syrians back, right? So I think that is a shift. Not that our traditional liberal democracies were I lived in Canada for many years, and of course there was always a struggle about respecting that obligation. But I think there is a really clear shift. Okay. So now I'll let you both come back.
Canada. There are lots of dimensions to pervasive racism that exist in liberal democratic states, but I think what you point to is that the employment pathway really matters, and it's inadequate in a lot of liberal democratic states, and that leads to, for instance, the lack of recognition of qualifications, or significant time lags in how people can use their skills and their qualifications. In Europe, we have the right to work for refugees, but we have significant time lags over the right to work for asylum seekers in this country, even after you've been through a year of being locked out of employment and opportunity, getting a national insurance number, being able to access the right to work and making it effective, really difficult, overcoming discrimination, xenophobia on the job market, really difficult. There's a lot to learn, for instance, from what Germany did in response to Syrian refugees. They got a lot of stuff wrong, but they got some stuff right. And so more and more there's learning about how you can integrate large numbers of people with moderate success through systematic vocational training, through access to higher education, and then through creating pathways from vocational and higher education into labour markets. I think employment pathways really matter, because all the literature tells us that employment is really important for psychosocial well-being for displaced people, particularly meaningful employment. It's a right in the second half of the 1951 Convention. Most of that's about socioeconomic rights. And I think politically it really matters. So politicians are really cutting their noses off to spite their faces by not allowing refugees and asylum seekers the right to work from day one. It's really questionable what it means for deterrence, if anything. What it does is it, I think, undermines public trust and confidence in the contributions that people can make when we exclude them from labour markets. So one of my graduate students did a great piece of work looking at the previous Conservative government in this country when, over the last couple of years, 2 big pieces of legislation came out restricting refugee rights. There were serious debates on expanding the speed with which asylum seekers are given the right to work. And strangely, in some ways, the majority of the Conservative Party seemed to be in favour of those rights, but the Home Secretary and the Cabinet were not, because of fear of how that would play out in the tabloid press and amongst many of their precarious base in red wall flip-flop states or constituencies. So yeah, I think it really matters to get that right on so many levels. In terms of the genealogy of the argument, I think this idea of what comes first, chicken and egg, is it these states trying to create refugees, or are they trying to instrumentalize them when they exist? It's more the latter, but they are obviously in this region, in this period, particularly involved in the creation of refugees. And I think this comes back to Arbie's question about what's particular about the geography, but what's also particular about the time period. So how does this argument travel across time, and how does it travel across geography? What's obviously interesting about this region in a post-colonial context is the borders are drawn in from an ethnic national identity perspective, a fairly arbitrary way, and that arbitrariness means that you have greater or lower levels of identification with leaders in capital cities and greater or lesser degrees of identification with populations across the border. That contributes to the dynamics of conflict, and those dynamics of conflict lead to movement across the borders to the other side of borders that in the Cold War period allows the instrumentalization of those opportunities. And that looks a bit different in a different era without those Cold War dynamics, but with a development paradigm and a liberal humanitarian paradigm in which different sets of carrots and resources are available for different sets of practices, but again, much more opportunistic and much less around the security dynamics between bilateral pairs of states or groups of states. I think the position on the world stage question is a really interesting one, and this is a story really about authoritarian states using refugees to legitimate themselves. And in the contemporary context, Kagame does this extraordinarily. You've got a regime that is looting Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. You've got a regime that's restricting civil and political rights to an extreme extent, limiting freedom of press, and yet is still beyond reproach when he travels to London or Washington DC, can do these bilateral deals with the UK government, isn't criticised by any of our political parties, and that's because he plays the liberal internationalist card really well, and it's this game of how do you instrumentalise the norms of international public policy makers for your own good. I mean, that leads to James' second question, the erosion of international norms and how that changes the picture. Those international norms are obviously important in their own right, but it comes back to that question of democratic backsliding is probably one of the most dangerous things for refugee rights, because you have the worst of all worlds. You have pandering to majoritarian populism, and you have the erosion of embedded liberalism. And so that backsliding is really risky and problematic. Those norms matter. I mean, looking around the world at a data set, which I looked at with my colleague Olivier Sturck, at what explains variation in socioeconomic rights, whether a country has signed and ratified the 1951 Convention, unsurprisingly, makes a big difference. It is also the moral legitimacy of the global north. So the point at which we have this separation, which allows the Canadas and Norways of this world to say, Kenya, you must not close Dadaab and Kakuma, and to go to the UN High Commissioner of Refugees and say, actually, no, we think you ought to have more progressive policies than you do, because otherwise there'll be consequences. That moral high ground disappears when the norms disappear and eroded, and there's no moral high ground left in the regime. And then the regime is really just a political game about which states pay the most, which states offer immediate short-term political incentives to get what they want, and you've lost the sense that it's part of a greater normative. And I agree with you, James. I think how surprised we are by this, I think, depends on where your starting point is.
Okay. You want to say anything? Do we have any? We're just about at the end. We're really at the end of our time, I think so. But we got most of your questions. We will adjourn from here to the White Horse Pub so that you could continue the conversation. Yes? And I want to thank you all for coming on this last day of term. In the end, quite a few of you showed up. And most of all, I want to thank our speakers and discussants. Yes?